Welcome to the AEI Education Podcast on the AEI Podcast channel. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Look, our podcast is simple. We bring conversations with guests at the center of education research, policy, and practice issues that affect families, schools, and students. Today, we have two excellent guests to discuss national assessments, mainly the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is often called the nation's report card, as well as international assessments, to talk about what they can tell us about the state of American education. First, I'll talk with Tom Loveless, a senior fellow at Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, about the use and misuse of these high-profile student assessments. After that, we'll speak with James Harvey, Executive Director of the National Superintendent's Roundtable, who will join me to talk about what he argues is NAEP's flawed proficiency benchmarks, how they may be causing the public to misinterpret NAEP results, and how they might even have broader impacts on state education policies. Without further ado, let's welcome Tom Loveless. Tom Loveless, thank you for joining us on the AEI Education Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we wanted to talk to you today about assessments, national and international. NAEP is the big one that gets referred to most often, and Maine NAEP is what gets the most attention. So in broad strokes, what is Maine NAEP? How long has it been going on, and why was it started?
The Maine NAEP started in the early 1990s, and it was started because there already was a NAEP test. It was called the long-term trend, and it had started in 1969. The long-term trend NAEP only gave national scores. It did not give state scores. It didn't give the scores for urban districts, although you could break out urban data, but it was rather difficult. So the Maine NAEP came along with the idea being that, first of all, it would be tested at grade levels as opposed to at different ages, and that it would include a state score component so the states could actually compare themselves and how they're doing compared to each other.
How frequently do we take this test, and what subjects are we taking them in?
The Maine NAEP is given in math and reading, and it's given every 2 years. Up until No Child Left Behind, it was given on somewhat of a haphazard schedule, but now No Child Left Behind mandated that it be given every 2 years in math and reading. It's given in grades 4 and 8. And there is a 12th grade Maine NAEP as well. That's not given as frequently.
Tom, I'm sure you've heard this before. I hear it all the time when we bring up tests, two sort of knee-jerk reactions. Over-testing is terrible. I don't want my kids taking more tests. This is a national test. And high-stakes tests are ruining education. Do either of those sort of criticisms land on NAEP? Should parents be concerned about this test?
No, they don't apply to NAEP. For one thing, the NAEP is a test that's given to a random sample of students in each state, so it's not as if everybody takes the NAEP test. Only a small number of kids in each state take the NAEP test. It usually runs around 180,000 kids nationwide every time NAEP is given. And it's a low-stakes test. The kids never find out their test scores. The schools never find out their kids' test scores. The lowest level of aggregation, again, setting aside the TUDA, which is an urban district test, the lowest level of aggregation is at the state level. So there's no accountability attached to the NAEP performance. All the criticisms of tests that you've mentioned do not apply to NAEP.
All right, so they don't apply to NAEP. That's good to know. What do we learn from NAEP? I mean, what kinds of information can we learn? And then, since the 90s, what have we been able to gain, at least in reading and math, about our education system?
NAEP serves one purpose, and it serves it very well, and that is it tells us at a single point in time, it gives us a snapshot of how kids are doing in math and reading. People try to stretch it out and make it do other things, like to evaluate policies. It's really not built for that. It can't help us with that. It can be used to document trends by just comparing scores over time, but those are different groups of kids each time. We don't follow a single group of kids through the grades to check longitudinal growth. So it's this cross-sectional snapshot of, how are fourth graders today doing versus how they did, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
And certainly those changes are important. So, what changes have we seen?
Well, in the last 10 years, I think the thing that people have been concerned about is we're seeing a flattening of scores. So the scores today in math, I should point out, not so much in reading. Reading scores have never moved a whole lot to begin with. But in let's say from the early 1990s up until the late 2000s, there was tremendous growth in math scores at both 4th and 8th grade, but especially at 4th grade. And since about 2009, those scores have been flat in mathematics. In reading, there was slight progress up until 2009. Since 2009, there's been basically flat scores in reading.
A little bit about, what we know here. Let me push on this a little bit. So we know that these aren't the same kids. These are just 8th graders in one year and 8th graders in another. And we know that there's been, particularly for 4th grade math, there's been improvements over time. So is it fair to say that U.S. 4th grade schools, U.S. elementary schools, are doing a better job educating kids in 2005 than they were in 1996?
No, not really. Because and that's one error people make when they interpret NAEP scores. All we know is that 4th graders were doing better at math in 2009 than they were in 1992. We don't know why. We don't know if it was schools. The kids' test scores are influenced by a lot of things besides schools. So we don't know that schools are doing a better job when NAEP scores are going up. We don't know that schools are doing a worse job if scores are going down. We just simply know that the kids that we're measuring at that particular point in time are scoring better. Now, obviously, schools have a lot to do with what kids know, but there are other factors, too, that can influence kids' test scores. So we know, for instance, that poverty is the most obvious influence on test scores. Families in poverty have children who score lower on not just NAEP, but all of these tests of academic achievement. It's not that the scores aren't, they may be suggestive of how well schools are doing, but they really cannot be used for that purpose because they can't isolate the school's effect from the other effects that may influence scores.
All right, so we can't necessarily say anything about schools. So when someone who's looking at these flat gains or these flat scores in recent years or the raised scores maybe from a decade ago, there's no way to say, oh, it's got to be No Child Left Behind or Obama's policies. It's obviously Common Core. There's no way to use these tests for those things.
Again, there are more sophisticated ways that researchers can model these scores and try to isolate the school effect. They never totally can do that, but they certainly can do a better job than just looking at the raw numbers and saying, well, the scores are going down, schools must be doing a worse job, or scores are going up, schools are doing a better job. That's the impulse that all sort of casual observers of NAEP scores want to make, and it should not be made.
Okay, so that's talking about over time. What about within an administration, right? We have these state-level scores through the TUDA, which I think stands for Trial Urban District Assessment. We have some district scores. What about comparisons between those representative bodies? What have we learned, and what should we infer, and what should we not?
Actually, the comparing states, for example, illustrates the point that I just made. So the comparison everyone wants to make is, let's take a state that perennially scores near the top. Let's take the state of Massachusetts. It scores near the top of all the states, and it has, by the way, since the 1990s. It's always scored near the top. And let's take a state that scores near the bottom, Mississippi. We cannot conclude from that the schools in Massachusetts are obviously better than the schools in Mississippi. The factors I just mentioned, such as the level of poverty, also the level of parental education. The kids in Massachusetts are much less likely to be in poverty than in Mississippi. They're also more likely to come from families where either one parent or both parents have college degrees than in Mississippi. So that's actually a very telling illustration of why you can't use these scores, to judge the quality of schools. Another point I would make, and this is important, within every state in the country, including that, let's take that top scoring state of Massachusetts.
All right.
Inside of Massachusetts, you have a little mini Massachusetts-Mississippi gap between the top scoring districts in Massachusetts and the bottom scoring districts in Massachusetts, or between the top scoring schools in Massachusetts and the bottom scoring schools in Massachusetts. And you can find those gaps on the state tests. All of our states give tests. And what they show is this incredible diversity within the state in terms of test scores. Now, one of the ways to get around the problem of these other influences on scores and to look at growth in a legitimate way, trends in a legitimate way, is to adjust for poverty, adjust for parental education, adjust for the percentage of kids who are learning English for the first time, adjust for these factors, again, that we know are correlated with test scores, and then track that growth over time.
So you mentioned earlier the long-term trend, which has been around for a lot longer. Just briefly, why did they jump from the long-term trend, and are they still doing the long-term trend?
They have the long-term trend scheduled for the year 2024. It was last given in 2012. It has not been given since 2012. Why did they jump from the long-term trend to the main NAEP? Well, like I said, they created the main NAEP because they wanted to have state-level test scores. They also did some things with the main NAEP that they had not done with the long-term trend, such as they tied the test content itself more to sort of modern ideas about curriculum. So the math test, for example, on the main NAEP is different in content from the long-term trend. They also created performance levels. The board that governs NAEP goes by the acronym NAGB, NAGB, and they felt that just releasing raw test scores, like on a scale, wasn't understandable to the public. So they wanted to start reporting the percent of kids at these different levels. The percent proficient is the most renowned. So that's on the main NAEP. That was, again, part of the reason for the creation of the main NAEP.
So, Tom, you've done a lot of work on international assessments, too, and involved with them, particularly PISA and TIMSS. You know, every few years, one of these international assessments comes out. They have a bunch of different countries take sort of representative samples. And frequently what I see in the papers is, you know, PISA report comes out. U.S. doesn't do as well as we thought. This should be a wake-up call. This is the alarm clock. How does that cycle repeat, and how much value do you think there is in the way we consume these international assessments?
Yeah. Well, just a little background first on the two tests. They are also quite different. As I mentioned, the two NAEP tests are different. The PISA and the TIMSS tests are very different. The PISA test is given to 15-year-olds, and it reflects what a group of international experts in math, reading, and science think 15-year-olds should know. And the TIMSS test comes from a different point of view. The TIMSS test is constructed around what do schools teach worldwide? What are some of the common topics that are taught worldwide in reading, math, and science? And so it tests on that basis. The TIMSS test is given every 4 years in math and science. It's grade-based test. It's given at 4th and 8th grades. The PISA is given every 3 years. The one good thing about the 4-year schedule is you can create, by testing in 4th and 8th grade, you can create these little pseudo cohorts. You can look at 4th grade scores, and then 4 years later look at 8th grade scores. And even though they're not the same kids, country by country, you can get kind of an idea of how these pseudo cohorts are functioning in their growth from 4th to 8th grade.
Right, because the 4th graders in one administration are the 8th graders
Yep.
in the next, at least, more or less. So that makes sense. And so what about the treatment in the press of, and just popularly about the import of these findings? I mean, we never seem to be at the top of them.
No, and we never have been. So the headline in 1967, when the very first set of international scores came out in math, was there were 12 countries that participated. The United States scored 11th out of the 12.
Yikes.
The headline was just how poorly we had done. Now that's over 50 years ago. So we've never done, and that was the very first one. A lot of people have the idea that the U.S. at some point in the past had the top schools in the world. We did not. We never have. So the very first test, we were 11th out of 12. We score around the middle of the pack on PISA. And PISA usually is the test that generates the most consternation in the United States. When PISA results come out, we score around the middle, and people forget that we've always scored around the middle on PISA, and they say, oh, this is just so terrible, and there's a lot of hand-wringing. On TIMSS, the U.S. scores a little higher, a little above average, typically, on reading especially. And the reading test is called PEARLS. It's the sister test of TIMSS. The U.S. scores very well on PEARLS, although we in the last run of PEARLS, we declined. But typically, the U.S. scores above average on TIMSS and PEARLS. Now, the group of countries on TIMSS, part of the reason for that, there are many more developing nations on TIMSS, so you're comparing the U.S. to a different group of countries.
Less developed. So, well, let me ask you a question about sort of the countries generally on these exams. Do they move much? I assume that certain countries, for a lot of important structural and cultural reasons, are going to have students that score better or worse. My thought is that those wouldn't move too much. So are there countries that move up and down on these tests over time?
There are countries that have moved up and down. And one country that is not remarked upon very much on TIMSS is Portugal. Portugal's shown quite a bit of growth in the last 20 years on TIMSS. By the way, the U.S. scores on the last TIMSS did show statistically significant growth from the first TIMSS that was given in 1995. So the U.S. does show significant growth on TIMSS. Those scores have been going up. And then on PISA, there are countries such as Poland has been moving up. A former darling of PISA, Finland, has been moving down. And you get a country like New Zealand. New Zealand's interesting, I always follow, because it actually does rather poorly on TIMSS, but it does very well on PISA. So the New Zealand scores are at right around the international average or even slightly below it, typically on TIMSS, but on PISA they look much better.
Well, thanks, Tom, for coming on and giving us sort of a primer on what to look for. Of course, these news stories come around regularly, but I looked up the schedule, and it looks like PISA will come out around the end of 2019. We'll have to wait until 2025 or so for the long-term trend news, and NAEP and TIMSS will come out sort of in the in-between. So we have a while before those newspaper stories come out, but we'll know a little better how to deal with them when they do.
Yeah, and the next one you can predict, because this is a PISA year, 2018, so the scores will be out in December of the following year, next December 2019. You can almost write the headline now. There's going to be a lot of disappointment. There always is when PISA scores come out.
Well, when it comes out, maybe we'll have you back on to discuss it.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Tom Lovelace gave us a good idea about how NAEP and various international assessments can be used and sometimes misused by the public and the media. But we wanted to focus on the NAEP, one of the most influential tests that students take every 2 years. So we spoke with James Harvey, the executive director of the National Superintendent Roundtable, to discuss the controversy over the cut points that NAEP uses to categorize students as scoring basic, proficient, or advanced, and how these cut points can end up ultimately sometimes misleading policymakers and the public. James Harvey, welcome to the AEI Education Podcast.
Thank you so much, Nat. I'm very pleased to be here.
And thank you for being here. Now, you're the executive director of the National Superintendents Roundtable. And superintendents, they pay attention to NAEP because they have to. I'm wondering, how do your members sort of use the information that they get from NAEP?
I'm actually not sure that superintendents do pay a lot of attention to NAEP, since with the exception of the Urban District Trial Administration, TUDA, there is no data available at the district level from NAEP. NAEP provides national estimates of student performance by grade level and by important curricular areas. It provides state estimates of student performance by the same metrics, and it also breaks it down by gender, race, and ethnicity. But with the exception of TUDA, the Trial Urban Districts Administration assessment of NAEP, there is no district data. So School superintendents, when looking at NAEP data, are looking at best at state data. They can't use it at the local level. And of course, they're as concerned with the results that they see reported in the newspapers.
Sure. So the way the newspapers sort of use NAEP data and turn around these definitions, you've had some concerns with, particularly with the benchmarks they've used. Can you explain your concerns?
Yes, I can. I want to say first that I've been a long-time admirer of NAEP. I'm aware of it going back to the 1970s. And it's been the foundation for large-scale assessments, and it gives us a picture of student performance in the United States going back to the 1970s. But I really believe it's being misused. NAEP really went off the track in the 1990s. To some extent, it became politicized, and it introduced benchmarks of basic, proficient, and advanced, and our research suggests that these are defective and misleading terms. They're very hard to understand, and their use has misled the press and the public.
So, James, what was the reason to introduce them? I mean, they didn't have them earlier in the long-term trend. What was the demand?
Well, NAEP originally was designed to give us a picture of how much our students knew in different grades and in different subjects. When these benchmarks were introduced, they changed the nature of the assessment because now the question was not just what did they know, it was how much did they know and when should they know it. And that changed the nature of the assessment. These benchmarks were introduced in the late 1990s and late 1980s after A Nation at Risk came out earlier in the decade, when there was a great concern about the performance of American students. And I think that fairly conservative members of the National Assessment Governing Board decided that they wanted to set artificially high levels of performance that would demonstrate that the schools weren't performing very well.
Yeah, so for instance, in April, results came out, and I'm sure a newspaper reporter could say, well, fourth graders, only 80% of fourth graders reached the basic level, and only 40% reached proficiency. In fourth grade math, eighth grade numbers were worse. Reading wasn't much better. Only 10% of students reached the advanced category. My, our progress has been stalled. How do you respond?
I respond by saying that these benchmarks were developed with almost no public input, and they were developed in a remarkably short period of time over the opposition of statisticians who were advising the National Assessment Governing Board at the time. People interpret this term proficient as meaning performance at grade level, although the acting director of the National Center for Education Statistics, Peggy Carr, earlier this year made it crystal clear that NAEP's basic benchmark is a much better guide to grade level performance. Our research, which is contained in a report called How High the Bar, concludes that the vast majority of students in almost every country in the world cannot clear NAEP's proficiency bar.
So interesting, and we will link to that How High the Bar report in our show notes. But the question I have is, how do you figure this out? How did you go about trying to figure out how international students would fare on these NAEP benchmarks?
We used two approaches, Nat. One was an approach developed by a colleague of yours at the American Institute of Research, Gary Phillips. He really did all of the hard work to how you statistically connect one report in the United States, NAEP, with international assessments such as TIMSS, which measures math and science results in grade 4 and grade 8, and PEARLS, which is a reading assessment. And these are very highly regarded assessments in the psychometric community. We adopted Gary Phillips' methodology and went a step further with it with the grade 4 assessment. And then the second approach we took was a linking assessment, an equipercentile ranking assessment, where we said, well, if you're on the 50th percentile on the NAEP assessment, what would that number be on TIMSS in 8th grade math or TIMSS in 4th grade science?
So if these proficiency levels, or what's considered proficient on NAEP, are too high, certainly that's going to lead to newspaper reporters, maybe politicians saying, oh no, our schools are failing and so forth. Are there any other more substantive differences? I mean, we've had a lot of education policy that has gone on since the advent of NAEP in the 90s. I mean, this is well before No Child Left Behind, Common Core, all these other things. Are those developments, do they stand apart from these NAEP proficiency levels, or do these NAEP proficiency levels perhaps play a role in how those things develop and play out?
One example of the differences between the international assessments and the national assessments is in grade 4 reading. what we find there is that NAEP says that only about 30% of our fourth graders are proficient in reading, whereas the number is nearly twice as high on this PEARLS International Assessment. So basically, assessments of American students on two different tests, one the international test and one the NAEP test, show vastly different results. And that was actually first came to my attention in the late 1990s. And I thought, well, that's peculiar. Which one of these is correct? So that's what prompted my interest in this. I want to make it clear, Nat, that we are not calling for lower standards. What we're interested in is having the benchmarks properly labeled. So one suggestion that we make in one of our reports was that instead of basic, proficient, and advanced, which are the NAEP terms, that we use low, intermediate, high, and advanced, which are the international terms. So that would be sort of a way of conforming the two different assessments to each other. If the term proficient is essential from NAEP's point of view, then we would prefer that they use the terms below grade level, at grade level, proficient, and advanced. So we're not trying to change the standards. We're trying to get them properly labeled so that people aren't misled.
So as far as the political likelihood of actually changing these terms, do you see NAGB and others in the policy community receptive to these changes? How much of a positive reception have you gotten to your report and your arguments, or do you think that it's uphill battle since these have been in place?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I was pleased to say that Peggy Carr, the acting director of NCES, made a public statement earlier this year that if you're interested in grade level performance, basic is what you should be looking at. She also said, and I think our report had something to do with this, that we have been getting an earful, that was the phrase she used, from the school community about these terms. So I know they have been looking at them, and in fact they commissioned some papers from policy wonks such as Jack Jennings, the former chief counsel of the House Committee on Education and Labor, to look into these things. So I'm hoping they'll look at them. I'm hoping they'll look at it again.
Well, it's interesting because I note that these benchmarks are still, though they've been in place for closing in on 30 years here, they're still established on a trial basis. So maybe by the time they pull them out of the trial basis and put them on a permanent footing, they might issue a different set of labels.
I'm hoping that we might have some hearings in Congress about this issue. Congress has taken a great interest in it over the years, and moving forward as though these are scientifically accurate and the question has been resolved, I think is a mistake. And that's a particular issue in this day and age. I mean, to some extent you could say, well, the horse is out of the barn with NAEP. But the people in favor of these benchmarks are now harnessing those horses up to a new carriage with the Common Core assessments. And PARCC and SBAC, the most common of the Common Core assessments, and several of the individual state assessments, including the New York State Assessment and the Florida State Assessment, their benchmarks basically mirror NAEP's proficiency benchmark. So what had been a benchmark that applied only to national groups can now be used to really call into question the performance of individual students and individual schools. And I think it's become a much more high-stakes issue today than it was even 20 years ago.
Right. So you're saying, to some degree, the benchmarking on NAEP has bled over into state assessments that are not low-stake assessments, but are high-stakes assessments for schools, communities, teachers.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, well, that does give some pause for thought and reiterates how important the issue of the benchmarking is. James Harvey, thanks for coming by and talking to us on the AEI Education Podcast, and we will be on the lookout for more NAEP news.
Thank you so much, Nat. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the AEI Education Podcast on the AEI Podcast channel. And special thanks to our guests, Tom Lovelace and James Harvey. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And don't forget to rate us and review us on iTunes or Google. We are looking for a new podcast name. So if you have any suggestions for what our future name should be, send it to ed.podcast@aei.org. You'll get a shout out in the next episode if your suggestion is chosen. If you have any other comments, questions, or topic suggestions for future episodes, you can reach us again at ed.podcast@aei.org. That's all for this episode. This is Nat Malkus, signing off until the next time.